'Tis many's a gay night from dark till daylight I spend with people of high renown. But in all their grandeur and heaps to squander, my heart would wander for sweet Omagh town.
Omagh town does not embrace itself to the visitor very easily when they walk into Omagh. There's nothing in Omagh really that they see to impress them, other than, what do we have on the main street? We have one big long main street, and at the top of it is the courthouse, and the courthouse, of course, is John Hargreaves. I would say it's like a palatial mansion stuck at the top of the town that serves as the courthouse. Omagh's treasures are to be found in the surrounding areas. All the antiquities are hidden away, and you have to know where to go to find them, and there's no question about it. The history of Omagh and the surrounding district is extremely interesting.
The voice of Haldane Mitchell, retired GP and active local historian. Born in 1936, he is very much an Omagh man, and, like his father before him, he served as a family doctor, all and sundry, in our small rural county town. Like many family doctors, he has witnessed all aspects of life, from the cradle to the grave. His vocation as a GP and his love for his native town has earned him a special place in the affections of local people. Not surprisingly, I began by asking him to describe, in his own words, a typical resident of sweet Omagh town.
Omagh people are quiet, unassuming people, and you have to get to know them. They don't go out of the way to get to know you. And I think that's what stands out of an Omagh people. And yet, if they go away, as a lot of them do, and if you meet them, if you met an Omagh man in London or in New York, he'd probably say more to you in an hour than he would say to you if you met him in Omagh in a week.
Just a matter of interest, how would you describe Omagh? And what does Omagh mean to you as a town?
Well, of course, it's the county town of Tyrone. Has been since the 1780s. The town grew up in the farming area. If the farmers are doing well, Omagh's doing well. If the farming community is not doing well, and of course they have their problems at the present time, well then the town suffers.
To date, Haldane Mitchell has written and published 5 books entitled Images of Omagh. These books are a visual history of the changing town, comprising photographs spanning almost a century. This collection rekindles days gone by in this market town west of the Bann. Dr. Mitchell has had the insight to realise the historical, cultural and social value of individual old photographs.
I think basically one has to look at historical photography. Basically that is what it all comes down to. The books contain a lot of people's photographs, schools, various societies, clubs and so forth over the years, right away back to the late 1800s, in the early days of photography. And people in the town are seeing their uncles, aunts, grandfathers, grandmothers. And it's interesting that from the letters that I would get from people, I would get letters from people all over the world. Mainly in England, of course, but a few in the south of Ireland, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and North America. English expatriates, I always say, come home and visit their relations at Christmas, Easter, and the summer, and they go into the tourist office, go to the bookshops in town and see them and look through them. And I've been told in various places in town that people look at them and start laughing. They laugh at because they see their uncles or their aunts or their grandmothers. And of course, this is the reason for it. And of course, if you can put plenty of old school photographs, and soccer teams, Gaelic teams, darts teams, doesn't matter what it is, with clay pigeon, shooting or shooting on a pigeon top. But you're absolutely right. In the surgery, when I was in general practice, many people would bring in photographs. I never refused any, because the simple reason you didn't know when that person was going to produce something else, although only a fraction of those that were brought were ever published. I think normally the books were about 160 pages, and in my collection at home now I would have over 3,000. One of the main problems is naming old school photographs. This is the difficulty. If somebody goes in and produces a photograph and say, this is Dressick Primary School in 1920, without a name, and they simply say, oh, my uncle was the teacher, but unless you can name all the kids, well, it's not worth producing. But there's always stuff coming to the fore, and as long as there's stuff coming to the fore, I'll keep it, and you never know, it might appear one of these days.
Well then, you obviously had an interest in local history and recording the passage of time long before the Images of Omagh actually appeared as a publication. Was your father interested in history, local history, the stories of what had gone before?
Very much so.
Did he talk too much about it?
Oh, he did. I think basically there are two aspects to life, to my life, that have influenced me, and one was my grandfather. Now, very few people will know, but my grandfather was a Reformed Presbyterian minister in Dervock, the Reverend R.G. McElmoyle. He was 60 years in the Scottish Covenanter Church, and he was better known for his breeding of Border Leicester sheep. Now, in the early days of the Young Farmers Club, he was used to go around the countryside to promote young farmers clubs, and his interest was telling stories. He was a wonderful storyteller. What would you say? He was used as a lecturer by the Farmers Union, and he was he came a lot to Fermanagh, and he used to stay with us in Omagh, and he and my father, I think, discussed this a lot. And I know that my father's interest basically would have been in country architecture. He was always interested in farmhouses and how farmhouses could be improved to improve the health of the individuals in them. I mean, you know, in the old days, once you finished the washing up, you just simply threw the water out over the half door, opened the half door and threw the water out. Well, of course, that's very unhygienic. He was against that, and the hens that sat on the half door and just messed the forecourt of the house. He said that couldn't be healthy. He also was a great one for having the private dry toilets as far away from the house as possible and near a running stream. And but as well as that was basically housing. And the other thing he was interested in was Irish traditional music. He always, in the early days, would go around the area that he was born and brought up in, and often played the violin with small groups, violin and melodeon, purely for the entertainment of the locals. And I know that he had an interest in Irish set dancing, which was danced quite a bit in the country houses in the Mountfield area when he was young. And I can always remember, it was very interesting when you go back that far. He, even when he was a student, when the folk in the area knew he was home and they were looking for a doctor, they wouldn't send any further than down to Maine, it's in Mountfield for him. And of course there were no cars in those days, and he would get on the horse and he'd rode the horse to Mountfield to see the patients. As well as that, he was well known in Gorton for some reason or other, and he often went to Gorton by horseback as well, over the Fala Mountain. And When he qualified and came home, he didn't marry until he was 46, and he lived in Campsie with a housekeeper and a chauffeur, believe it or not. And he had I remember him talking about he had a wonderful standard car, and I remember him telling me he'd been at a confinement up near Derbycroy, which is about 5 miles out of Omagh, and this would have been it would have been in the 30s, early 30s actually, and they were coming home and they ran out of petrol somewhere about 2 or 3 miles out of Omagh. And of course in those days petrol, you wouldn't have got petrol, there weren't petrol pumps and so forth and so on. And I know that they had whiskey in the car, and he always carried whiskey as an additional part of his medicine. And I know that Mr. Nixon told me that that he had remembered from his wartime exploits that some vehicles would go on whiskey, and they put the whiskey actually in the car, and the car actually did start, and he got home. And in fact, the next chauffeur my father had was Harry Graham, and as everybody knows in Omagh, Harry drove Pollock's hearse for many years up until he retired, and Harry's still alive, and I'm sure he's well into his 80s now, but Harry once was my father's chauffeur many years ago.
You mentioned earlier on that you would accompany your father on his rounds. Is there anything Haldane that stands out in your mind from those days?
Well, of course, the oldest part of Omagh is Castle Street, Abbey Street area, and we would always have looked upon that area of the town being the oldest town, and naturally enough you'd have expected to see some of the more slum areas there. For example, Fountain Lane. Now, Fountain Lane was interesting because I can remember visiting with my father in Fountain Lane, and some of the houses in Fountain Lane were occupied by two families, a family on the ground floor and a family upstairs. And if you were visiting the upstairs family, you had to excuse yourself to the ground floor family to go upstairs. And of course there was River Row off Castle Street, and of course there was the famous Rat's Pad. The Rat's Pad actually wasn't off Castle Street, as a lot of people think. The Rat's Pad was behind Ashfield Terrace. It's not there now, but it would have been behind where the Ashfield Bakery or the Tile Centre is today. And those that lived in it would have referred to it in more polite terms as Gortmore Close. But if you ask anybody in Omagh where Gortmore Close is, I would say 90% of the people couldn't tell you. But if you'd gone in there, those people had literally nothing. I mean, sometimes they hadn't glass in their windows, sometimes it was just hessian bags to cover the openings. But with the development of housing down the Derry Road, houses in Hospital Road, and then of course then the quite large estates that were built on the Dromore Road, all these properties have gone, and of course there's nothing left of Brook Street today. The primary school is on the site of Fountain Lane, one bit of it, and the rest of it's a car park. In fact, Omagh has no Victorian slums now at all, which is something to be said for the town. The Galashill area, those houses have all been given their plumbing, their electricity, and their running water and their flush toilets. They were built with dry toilets, but they don't have them today.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned to me earlier you would go out with him on his rounds occasionally, or out with him to visit. You mentioned one particular spot. How often did you do that, and what kind of an insight did you get into the life of a GP from those early experiences?
Well, prior to the health scheme in 1948, the health setup was basically divided into dispensaries, and the dispensaries were basically for the folk that were getting government paid health service. Now, my father was the dispensary doctor in Beera. James Cunningham in John Street was the dispensary doctor in Carrickmore, and the well-known Dr. Bernard Lagan was the dispensary doctor in Omagh. Now, up until 48. Although Dr. Lagan, for example, had his practice in Campsie, the dispensary was in the old workhouse, which is up now beside, well, it was beside the present police barracks, but that was knocked down in the 60s. But the actual dispensary was there. And Dr. Lagan, well, the interesting thing about Dr. Lagan is 1948, when the health scheme came in, he had the largest practice, rural practice in Northern Ireland. His practice extended from Carrickmore to Etterney and from Sion Mills to Ballygawley. A lot of people don't realise this. And he and my father worked very much together because of the fact that they only lived about 50 or 60 yards apart on Campsie Road. And in 40, and another interesting thing is that prior to the 1950s, there was only one consultant in the county hospital, and that was the late Arthur Eaton. Now, Arthur Eaton couldn't do all the work, and Dr. Lagan did a lot of surgery as well. And my father actually was helped out with the anaesthetics. My father could see the health scheme coming, and neither of the two of them had secondary degrees, so my father left. He wasn't going to get a job. Barney stayed on till the health scheme came in, and regrettably, not having had his FRCS, he wasn't taken on as a consultant, which I think he held against the government, I think, to the day he died. But after that, of course, they brought in more consultants into the health scheme. They brought in a physician and extra surgeons and so forth, and it built up to what it is today. But believe it or not, just after the war in 48, there was only the one consultant. Covered everything. Dr. Eaton, the surgeon, who lived up in Common Hill House, where the Ward 12 geriatric is today, he lived up there. And he did the obstetrics and cesarean sections. It's interesting, actually, as far as Dr. Lagan and my father are concerned. They used to have tonsil removing sessions. And when they decided in different families where kids needed their tonsils, they would decide on a house where they were going to take the tonsils out. So you had to have your kids' tonsils out, so you brought them to Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so. So my father gave the anaesthetics. Barney Lagan removed the tonsils, and they were removed on the kitchen table as usual. And then in the evening they would get together, and these kids would have been brought home to their own homes. So then they would decide, well, they'd take, say, 4 out, 4 different families, and then in the evening they would decide, right, one doctor would visit 2 houses to make sure the kids were okay, because these were guillotined, not dissected out like they are today. And the other doctor, i.e. Dr. Lagan, would have gone to the other 2 houses just to make sure the kids were okay. That's the way the tonsils were removed prior to 48. Any ENT consultants that are listening will probably cringe. I can always remember a very interesting story my father told me once, and they had a maternity case that wasn't going terribly well, and the fetal heart went off. Dr. Lagan decided the only thing to do was a cesarean section, and he said, I don't think this patient will make the hospital, that she'll probably lose her baby. So they simply did the section there and then in the house with dripped ether, and he always carried his his operating instruments with him, just in case. And they did a cesarean section in a house on about 7 or 8 miles from Omagh in the 1920s, and then admitted the patient. The baby was okay, admitted the patient to the hospital after that. The modern day doctors wouldn't believe that these things happened, but there are quite a few surgical instruments still in our house that my father used. It's pretty interesting. One interesting thing that I always remember that when he was at college in Scotland, he did a parallel dental course with medicine but when it came to the final exams, he took his final exams in medicine, but he didn't take his dental exams. Now, whether it was financial or whether it was he hadn't worked or not, I simply don't know. But all through his working life, he carried a set of dental forceps with him in his bag, that anybody that required, that a toothache required dental extractions, that there was nothing to him. He would have removed teeth at any hour of the day or night, but unfortunately there was no anaesthetic. And as well as that, he was a great believer in chiropody. He always felt that if your nails weren't correct, you didn't walk properly, and he did a lot of the old folks chiropody in their own homes. And he taught me all the arts of chiropody, and I would have used my own, done a little bit of chiropody during my working life.
A man of many parts, and a jack of all trades in a way. Did your father practice until he died, or did he retire?
No. My father practiced no more from 1919. It's rather interesting, actually. There was no retiring age. He didn't retire in those days. I think it's fair to say that I came to him in 61. He died in 67, having had, I think, his third coronary. He hadn't practiced for 6 months before his death. He was in his 83rd year. He was the longest surviving member of his family, of which there were too numerous to mention. So many, as happens in Irish families over the years, quite a few had died at childbirth. And we often wonder, when we look at the past and look at how many kids some of the families had in Ireland. It was all over the island. It wasn't a case of in County Tyrone. But whenever you talk to folk about their families, their wealth was in their families in those days. With the number of kids they had that could come to maturity and earn a living, that was the ladies of the house used to always tell me, my wealth is in my family.
Well, was there a medical background on your father's side then, or how did he get into the profession?
No idea. I think that if the truth was told, if you look at Irish families, there was a breakup of the church, medicine, law, and nursing. And it's interesting, in my father's family, he did medicine. His brother Jim did law, and his brother John did medicine, and then changed over and went into the Church of Scotland, was a Church of Scotland minister for the rest of his life. But it's interesting, he married a Scotch lassie, and their two children both did medicine. I think it's traditional, and even in some families today, you'll find that there's the church is a priority in so many families. Nursing, medicine, law, it was very common, and now they're adding, of course, accountancy and computers, what have you. They're taking over now, but that's the way it was, and that's the way things are going, I suppose. But there was no family history of medicine prior to that. No, I have no knowledge of it. None.
Well, to kind of go back to the local history aspect, were you aware when you would go out with your father on his visits that it was a changing world, that there was a veil being drawn over that the turf fire and the small windows and the unhygienic conditions? Were you aware? Were you very conscious that it was a world that was changed, and this was, as Michael J. Murphy said, the embers of the day in tradition?
Oh, there's no question about it. There's no question about it, because my father had an absolute love for the people he looked after, and it didn't matter whether he looked after them or not. I mean, to say he enjoyed company, and he never had a surgery. He simply had a session in the morning and a session in the afternoon and a session in the evening in the surgery, and then after that he'd often head off into the country, north, south, east or west, and not come home many's a time until 2 in the morning. And the problem was, in those days there weren't any phones. I can remember very well Dr. Lagan coming up one day to my father. I remember my mother telling me this story, and why he was up. He was up because of the fact that they were putting up a telephone box in Campsie, and he was very worried that these telephone boxes would go up throughout the whole countryside and they'd be worked off their feet. And I remember the one in Campsie's still there. The one in Campsie's beside the Campsie shop, but he came in to my father one night and wanted to know what they could do about this telephone box. But of course there was no way of contact. The telephones were few and far between in those days. And I mean, I know my father would have gone out at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and my mother wouldn't have seen him until he would have come in and gone to bed, and she would have got him up in the morning when the first patient came into the surgery. And that's the way it would have been. But he enjoyed the chat round the fire and the open fire. And I mean, my father's attitude was, if you let the patient, or if it was a child, the patient's mother, tell their own story, and give them time to tell their own story, and not rush them or not hassle them, you'll often find that you can come to a very good idea what's wrong, or even come to a diagnosis before you lay a hand on the patient. I think basically that's what I'm saying, that he always had time to listen. And it's a funny thing that even to the present day, a lot of people still remember my father, talk about him and the things he did and the way he went about it and so forth and so on. Whereas the things have gathered momentum to such an extent that people don't talk about people to the same extent today, because the simple reason is they always say they haven't the time. My father's attitude always was, if you want time, you can make time, because the man that made it made plenty of it.